everyone. My name is Bruce Sellery. I am the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today, we are going to focus on oil and gas. And this is a sector that has been hit not with a 1-2 punch, but a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 series of body blows, geopolitical situations, domestic politics, environmental questions, changing technologies, and now a pandemic that has suppressed demand globally. It is a lot. Now, as someone who's spent a long time living in Alberta, I know just how resilient the people of the West are, and I'm optimistic that they will sort through it. This is the focus of our conversation today. Some guidelines on how to engage with our event. As you look at your screen, there is a button that says click here to switch stream. That button will lower the resolution of the video if your Wi-Fi or internet service is a little bit unstable. The questions tab is how you can type in a question and send it along through to us so that we can include it in the discussion. And the request help button is just that. If you have some technical questions, we can do that. We are pleased to host today's event in partnership with the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Center at the Ivey Business School, as well as the Ivey Academy. Now, to introduce our panelist. Martha Hall-Findlay is the Chief Sustainability Officer for Suncor. Gordon Lambert is the former CEO of the Alberta Energy Regulator. Samantha Stuart is the Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Development at TC Energy. And today's moderator is Guy Holburn, Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy, and also the Director at Ivey's Energy Policy and Management Center at the Ivey Business School at Western University. One of the club's traditions that we have maintained in this virtual world is our toast. So if you're in your home office, in your office somewhere, and you have anything liquid nearby, if you could just join us in a toast to Canada. To our panelists, to Canada. Thank you for being here. Guy, I turn the Canadian Club podium over to you.
Okay, thank you, Bruce, for the introductions, and thank you to the Canadian Club for hosting this event. We have lots to discuss today with our esteemed panelists, so I'd like to jump straight into the conversation. And I'd like to begin with a question about the scale of the impact of the current crisis on the oil and gas sector. We've all read the press stories about global oil demand falling by 30%. We've seen oil prices plunging to an unimaginable negative almost $40 a barrel for WTI just a few weeks ago. So perhaps you can give us a sense for what you're seeing as the main effects in the oil and gas sector within Canada. And how would you compare the current crisis to previous downturns, recognizing that the oil and gas sector is one that's been used to traditional boom and bust cycle? So Martha, maybe we could kick off with you, as I know you're in fact actually a little bit newer to working in the oil and gas sector. And then we can come to Gord and to Samantha as well. So, Martha, over to you.
Well, it's interesting. Having been working in the public policy world for quite a few years, including the energy sector, yes, it's been 3 months now that I've been on the other side, and there's been no shortage of people saying, so how do you like the oil business now? There's no question it's been extraordinary. I mean, the history of oil and gas energy certainly has been, over the last number of decades, one of significant volatility. We've seen, the 1970s, we've seen the Asian financial crisis create real problems. This time we have a pretty unusual situation of a dramatic reduction in demand and a dramatic oversupply, all at the same time. And, we're seeing now the prices of oil are affected by the fact that there's not even enough place to put all the oil that the world is able to produce. So even when the Saudi Arabians and the Russians came to a little bit of an agreement, the problem is the storage tanks are full. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens as we come out of COVID, hopefully when we come out of COVID, to see what happens in terms of the reduction of that that backup of supply. And then an added twist, I think, will be, will the world significantly change after COVID? Will we really see significant reduction in travel, for example? The technology that we're using today is extraordinarily good now. And so that will affect energy use. And then when you add that combined to, you know, the concerns about the environment, concerns about climate have not gone away. And I would just say that part of the challenge we're facing is because of all of the economic downturn, some of the investments and some of the things that we would like to be able to do from an environmental perspective have been postponed. So all of those things are operating, I would say, in concert, but that would actually imply some collaboration. I think there's a bit of chaos out there, quite frankly.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned some of this uncertainty about what the oil and gas sector is going to look like in the future. We'll come to some of those discussions later on, but I think that's a good point about what the future really holds for the oil and gas sector. So, well, thank you for kicking us off, Martha. Gord, maybe we could come to you next. And you've had a long career in the oil and gas sector, and you've probably seen more than your fair share of booms and busts. So how do you see the current situation in light of this history within the oil sector? And maybe you could comment on some of the things that you feel have surprised you more this time compared to the past.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Guy. Well, certainly, if you've worked in the oil and gas sector for any period of time, you've gone through some dramatic cycles, but always with a recovery in some respects. And that recovery often is based on demand growth. And I think, to Martha's point, the prospect of what demand is going to look like, not just as a result of COVID, but coming out of it, makes this downturn different than others. And so are we going to see a peak demand in 2020 that some had imagined would happen in 2030, I think is the type of question at play. On the ground in the sector, the levers that you end up pulling and are being dramatically invoked right now are capital reductions. So CapEx budgets are being slashed to the bone. You see employment, of course, falling dramatically, and people are trying to reduce production. In some cases, losing money for every barrel produced. But not all producers are in the same circumstance. So some will have hedges on their crude that will shelter them for some period of time. It's a very diverse sector, and each company is in their own circumstance, but everybody's feeling the pain out of this downturn.
Mm-hmm. So just picking up on that diversity, Gord, we know there's a tremendous variation in terms of the types of technologies and the cost structures within the oil and gas sector. Can you give a sense for which types of companies you think are most exposed or are most struggling at this point in time, and which ones may be able to weather the storm a little bit better than others?
Yes, we imagined COVID as a disruption of oil demand globally. On the supply side of oil and gas, the emergence of tight oil and tight gas has been a dramatic disruption on the supply side of oil and gas as commodities. So we saw the US go from being the largest net importer of oil in the world to now being a net exporter, which in my lifetime I never imagined. And that had already been at play as a disrupting factor to Alberta and to Canada prior to COVID. So the higher cost oil right now, though, is the fracking type of oil, that tight oil. It's economic at around $50, $60. Mm-hmm. And at this price level, you see the US industry also being decimated. So that is a correction that is occurring, which also leaves companies in a mode of wondering how the fracking of the tight oil and gas producers will come out of this downturn. For oil sands, think of it as manufacturing oil. So it's a model where they don't have to worry about depletion of the resource. They can run their facilities in a really efficient manner and drive further efficiency in their cost structure but they don't have to keep drilling to keep production levels. And so in the oil sands, again, diversity of circumstance, but they can be competitive at prices around $30, $35 a barrel. They would be relatively healthy. So competitive, I guess, would be the way to frame the oil sands.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good perspective to have. It's not only the Canadian oil and gas sector that's had a major hit, but it's also the US, and the relative cost profiles and differentials are important in thinking about how one country's oil sector is impacted relative to another. And I think that point about the US oil shale sector is a good one, given that's a slightly higher cost level than some of the Canadian companies, at least. So Samantha, maybe we can turn to you, and you're at a slightly different position within the energy sector, being within pipelines, and much of the pipeline sector is rate regulated. So you're a little bit insulated from the vagaries of the global oil market. Maybe you could give us a sense for how you see the pipeline sector as being affected by the current crisis and the downturn in oil prices and oil demand globally.
Sure. I think you're right to bifurcate the pipeline sector between those that are rate regulated and those that might have more exposure to volumetric or commodity risk. From TC Energy's perspective, we're very much rate regulated. And so between the gas part of our portfolio and the oil part of our portfolio, we have very strong credit-worthy counterparties. And part of that is Gord and both Martha indicated. Many of the molecules that we move tend to be underpinned by companies that are very strong, have had access to capital markets, and will continue to grow their portfolios. So from that perspective, it does leave us somewhat insulated. I think, as both mentioned, we are entering unprecedented times. It will depend on the shape of the recovery, what happens with demand, how fast demand returns. And I think there is a component of, is energy transition on pause, and how does that factor in? And I think that continues to be important. And as we mentioned before, previously, that shape of the recovery, I can't express that enough. Canadian crude, as well as Canadian gas, becoming more and more competitive will be increasingly important going forward, as is access to capital.
Yeah. You mentioned before that some companies have got stronger balance sheets than others, and these are probably in a better position to deal with the current crisis and to come through it. Do you think that these companies with stronger balance sheets should be doing things differently at the moment? Are there perhaps some silver linings or some opportunities for companies recognizing that assets are cheap at the moment and demand at some point should recover in the future?
Mm-hmm. Assuming you're referring to the midstream sector versus the upstream, on the midstream side, I think those with strong balance sheets, we're entering into a time. We have, for example, a $43 billion growth program. We have plenty of growth in front of us. We'll continue to execute on that growth. I think what can be done differently, I know internally for us, we're looking at things like digital innovation, new arrangements with our customers, because we're all in this together. So we've got the balance sheet to look at bringing innovation in, thinking differently in terms of commercial arrangements, and working together in partnership with our shippers and our upstream partners. Now, when it comes to longer term portfolio allocation, it will be interesting to see, and we continue to monitor the outcome of the impact of COVID. But we do believe that, the continuing requirement for oil and gas going forward, we may see some changes in the shape of the demand curve longer term, but we believe that Canadian oil and gas has a significant portion to play.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So we're getting one of our first questions coming from the audience here, and this is around the future pricing of oil and gas. Now, WTI oil prices have fortunately rebounded from the negative $40 a barrel, and they've been positive. And they're currently around $20 a barrel, and their forecasts remain in the sort of $20 to $30 barrel range for the rest of the year. But this is still clearly less than half the pre-pandemic level, so a significant reduction compared to the last 5 years. So what does this mean for the oil and gas sector if oil prices stay at this level in the $20 to $30 barrel range? Is this a level that the oil and gas sector can compete at? Martha, did you want to have a quick stab at that?
Well, I think I'm not on mute. I'm good. I think it depends on where you are in the production stream. I think it really does depend on if you're upstream only and where you're upstream only. It depends on at what point the price encourages U.S. shale to come back. And Gord can speak to that well as well. It also depends. We talked a little bit about those companies that have strong balance sheets. Often those strong balance sheets come from the fact that they're diversified. So, in the case of Suncor, we have upstream, we have downstream, we have refining, we have Petro-Canada, we have a lot of areas of business. Just a basic business principle, diversification is usually pretty good, especially when you come into a crisis like this. So we're very bullish about the future, but nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody knows what will happen with COVID. Nobody knows if we'll have a second wave. Nobody really knows when we're going to have a vaccine. What these behaviors will do to change behaviors forever. Like the workplace is going to be forever changed. There will be probably less commuting, more people working from home. Well, what does that mean in terms of gasoline demand, for example? So there are all sorts of factors, Guy. I know you'd love an answer, but I think what we're really seeing is that it will depend on where you're playing. One thing I just want to touch, just in case we don't get a question on it, and Samantha mentioned that about what will happen with the energy transition and the focus will be even on that. And it speaks a little bit to diversification, but it also speaks to those who have strong balance sheets, have the opportunity more so to continue the investments in some of the environmental efforts, more so than some of the other companies. And so that in and of itself will encourage an even greater divergence, I think. And as consumers, investors, consumers become pickier, become more demanding of where they get, their energy from, I think it could actually end up being even more interesting. We're certainly very interested in looking at what role that certainly our company, but the industry in Canada can play in the transformation. And I would just say the other thing that I find with COVID that might be very interesting is we've seen a massive increase in the level of collaboration between government and business, whether it's for safety, health, all of the things that we're doing. Financial, of course, as well. So I'm actually really hoping that as we move toward finding more solutions to some of these environmental challenges, and climate being one, but not the only one, that we see a much greater enthusiasm, shall we say, for government and business collaboration on some of these things than we've seen in the past.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so I think there's a good point there about the pandemic as providing that impetus for diversification, innovation, as well as a bit of belt tightening. Gord, maybe I could ask you the same question. You've just recently retired from the Alberta Energy Regulator as CEO, so you've had this broader perspective in terms of the industry and how it's been managing in a lower price environment over the last 5 years, and now a very low price environment. What do you think are some of the strategies that firms can use to try and cope with prices in the $20 to $30 type of range?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of dimensions to that. One is I just want to reflect on the $20 to $30 price range, that we have to really be mindful that the revenue from oil is critically important to the producing countries. that it exists in. And so there's Saudi Arabia, for example, they rely on prices of oil that are probably north of $50 at least to meet their social needs. So I do think you'll see an effort to try and get back to a healthier price range. There's an aligned interest to try and get back up into that, call it 40 to 60 range. But in the $20 to $30 world, one thing you see is the innovation agenda is playing out hugely. Collaboration is one of the areas that we see a lot of really breakthrough things occurring. And an example of that is Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, which happened before the downturn, but where companies are coming together to share IP and accelerate the pace of environmental performance improvement. They've shared now $1.3 billion of IP, but we also see it in the conventional world as well, where companies are collaborating on a regional level to bring down the costs of abandonment of oil wells, for example. So they'll go to supply companies with a regional approach to how they go about doing that business, and they've seen a 30% reduction in costs of well abandonment and reclamation as a result of that. So it's innovation at every stage of the value chain, from the geology through to processing, through to how you move the oil, and ultimately to its end use, and to the abandonment and reclamation aspects as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so lots of moves here in terms of how companies are thinking about sort of new strategies around innovation, around diversification, to deal with at least some of this uncertainty over future prices. Maybe I could shift the conversation towards looking at the role of government. And we're now entering an era where we're seeing major government intervention into the economy to try and mitigate some of the effects of the pandemic on households, companies, and industries. And recently, we've just seen the government announce new loan options for large companies across a range of sectors, which come with some environmental conditions. And we've also seen the federal government contribute $1.7 billion to the Orphan Well Fund to help clean up abandoned oil and gas wells. So we're now seeing sort of government step in to provide some assistance. And my question is, do you think the government is striking the right balance in terms of providing some economic support for the oil and gas sector, while at the same time trying to keep an eye on its environmental and climate objectives? Does anyone want to kick off on that?
I think very much, Guy. I think certainly the Alberta government and the federal government, but the examples you were raising were really the federal government. I think we're talking an extraordinary amount of money, but certainly what we have been recommending to the government is things like the sectoral agnostic efforts. So not focusing on a sector, but focusing on individuals and families. And the wage subsidy support program, completely sectoral agnostic, and for a while it was, this should just be small businesses. And then, so, well, it's actually a small business, big business. It's all about a job lost is a job lost. And so if somebody loses their job, it doesn't matter to them necessarily whether it was a small business or a big business or what sector. And so I think the federal government has done a really good job in that regard, trying to deal with some of those issues. There are calls from all over the place for more money, of course, and it's difficult because the other part of this is that our kids, our grandkids are going to be paying the bill for a lot of these, and so trying to manage helping and providing support to people now, really important, obviously. But there has to always still be an eye on, okay, but what does the future look like? I would say, so we've actually been very supportive of what the governments have been trying to do. Listen, look at some of the other countries. I think Canada is stacking up pretty well. What I would say, though, is that it's not just about money. the federal government has actually postponed for a few months the gazetting of the Clean Fuel Standards proposed legislation. We think that's fantastic, not because of cost, not because of, but because it's actually really complicated. And for us to work together to make sure that we achieve collaboratively the goals that the government wants to achieve in that regard from an environmental perspective, that's really, really important. That showed actually on the part of the federal government, we were very impressed that they were willing to do that. I would say, we also talk about the energy transformation, and we talk about electrification. Electrification doesn't just happen. We have 13 jurisdictions in Canada, all of which actually deal with electricity differently, sometimes government run, government owned, sometimes not. And Suncor has our electric highway where we have, stations with charging stations all across the country. And yet it's really hard to actually provide electricity because of the regulatory piece. There's a real opportunity for the provinces and the federal government to work a whole lot more collaboratively to figure out how to make some of those things easier, because if you can't actually figure out how to charge and do it properly, people aren't going to be inclined to buy electric vehicles. So there's some really big opportunities for government that are not necessarily financial as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, so good point about these non-fiscal measures that may be able to advance multiple objectives on the economic side and also on the environment and climate side. We're getting a few questions here from the audience on some of these non-fiscal measures, and maybe we could turn to Samantha on this. And we've seen this long conversation in Canada over the last decade about how best to balance energy sector objectives around resource development, and particularly on market access and the development of pipelines, and how to balance these aspects along with achieving climate objectives. So how do you see the current crisis as affecting this conversation, and how do you think the government should be responding to some of these calls coming from different quarters about maybe trying to push ahead with some of these infrastructure projects that would provide a boost to the economy at a time when the economy is really in a tough position?
So I think not only is the economy in a tough position, I think government's in a tough position. And if we go back a little bit, recall there was a small little pipeline on the West Coast that all of us in Canada now own. And I think balancing and recognizing the contribution to GDP that oil and gas and energy makes in this country is really, really important to keep in context with our desire to diversify and our desire to meet our climate change objectives. So if you look at the contribution that government has made, and it's not only federal, it's also provincial, because they have also become involved in ensuring that we have cross-border market access and that we can continue to develop the resource base, which is that key contributor to GDP, job growth, taxes, etc. My sense is the balance makes sense at this stage. I think the weighing in and incorporation of some of the climate change objectives does need to be in balance. I think that industry is working very hard and very collaboratively with government, both on the upstream, the integrated oil, and the midstream side, to make sure that we can balance that. But it is a balance, and it requires us becoming competitive and maintaining our position of competitiveness globally, so that our oil and gas, whether through LNG exports or going to the US, that we can continue to compete and place those molecules. So that's a tough job for everyone involved, and everyone's working quite hard to achieve that end goal. What I do want to say, though, is watching subsequent to COVID, the amount of fiscal stimulus that has been deployed globally, in addition to North America, whether through Canada or the US, that's an awfully big check. And at a certain, so I question one, how is that fiscal stimulus rolling through? Is it going fast enough to influence that shape of the recovery. And the second thing is where, how, and when will we look to paying that bill back? And I think that's something that's going to be very, very important going forward, particularly in Canada, because of the resource base that we have, and ensuring that we can continue to be a place to invest going forward, and that we can access capital. We do have a stable fiscal regime. We do have a stable and clear regulatory regime, and that we continue to attract capital, and that we attract growing amounts of capital, because it will be a global race going forward. So I think those are all considerations as part of answering that question. Not an easy question to answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Gord, you've had a regulator's perspective over the last year or so in the AER. Maybe you could comment on what you see would be the appropriate role for government here in terms of trying to provide that balanced support for the oil and gas sector, while also trying to achieve some of these other environmental and climate objectives.
Well, I think Martha touched on this. Really focusing in on the employment aspects is a really central priority. So that means not picking winners and losers, having programs that are equally available to every company. So I thought the abandoned well funding was a very good step towards helping to ensure employment in an important aspect of the oil and gas sector, which is the service sector. Because coming out of this, it's not just jobs for Canadians, but we actually do need to ensure that the industry itself globally comes out of this, including Canada, with an oil and gas sector and service sector that's strong and is able to support activities going forward. So I think that's been exactly right. But of course, governments influence the regulatory landscape as well. It's the complexity of regulation that I think is often an opportunity area where we create new regulations to meet new issues and risks, but we often don't rationalize those against the legacy regulations that may not be as relevant or as required now. And so just rationalizing our regulations going forward and making sure they're fit for purpose, they're as efficient as they can be, is an element of what Samantha said of how do you attract capital. It's going to go to jurisdictions not that have relaxed regulatory regimes. They need to have absolutely great regulatory regimes and good regulations well enforced, but not unduly burdensome and complex.
And you'd mentioned before the role of innovation in the sector as well. And potentially this is an area where government can provide some assistance as well. Are there any particular innovation sectors, areas, technologies that you think are particularly promising that might help provide some sort of short-term assistance and also improve long-run competitive outcomes?
Well, one of the huge areas is just using big data and artificial intelligence. So that does involve things like in the Suncor world of autonomous trucks, for example. You can automate activities and processes that previously and make them more efficient. So we see that at play in all phases of oil and gas, right from how you find oil through to all that value chain I mentioned earlier, from the production through to marketing and end use. But we also see innovation in processes, industrial oil and gas processes, so new forms of upgrading, new forms of oil extraction. So in the oil sands world where steam is used to extract oil, known as steam-assisted gravity drainage, it is greenhouse gas intensive. That there's real work underway with commercial scale replacement with solvents or electricity that could result in dramatic improvements in greenhouse gas emissions and also in cost structure. Now, for the governments and for industry, it's to try and work to accelerate that. So time is not our friend. And often in the past, it's taken over 10 years to get these technologies from concept to commercialization. We don't have 10 years to spare, and governments also play a big role in de-risking the scale up of these technologies through partnership funding. That's been the history of innovation in the sector in the past with the Alberta Oil Sands Technology Research Authority, AOSTRA. I think that governments have to revisit that aspect of the innovation agenda and really take on in a collaborative way with industry and other stakeholders how we accelerate the improvement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we're getting a related question here from the audience around diversification and the role of government here. So in 1974, Peter Lougheed said that Alberta really had to save for the expected rainy days and to diversify the provincial economy away from oil and gas, given that it's a very cyclical industry. So the question is it a little bit late for this, or more positively, maybe I would frame it in terms of what do you think the government should be doing at this point to build on that suggestion to try and diversify at this point?
Guy, if you want, I'll jump in. I don't think we can look just to governments to do that. Governments don't run businesses, businesses run businesses, and governments have a role to play. And you heard me say before, I think there's a really important opportunity for collaboration. But, if to the extent that there are different products that can come from the oil that comes out of the ground. So really interesting things Alberta Innovates is doing in terms of carbon beyond bitumen. There's some really obviously chemicals that we use globally. Plastics, I know they have a bad reputation right now, but actually we use a lot of plastics for really good things in the world. So there are diversification opportunities within the industry as well. And where there is collaboration, or for example, the COSIA example that Gord gave, or maybe a potential opportunity for another AOSTRA-like opportunity to look at new technologies, for new energy technologies, for example. I think not just technologies to reduce our environmental footprint, but new energy technologies that might be cheaper, better, and cleaner. There's for sure some opportunities, but it's not just government. Government's not going to do this on their own, and industry in some cases could potentially do it, but could do it faster and better and more effectively if there's collaboration. And so I go back to what I think COVID has done for us is highlighted so much collaboration on some of the health and safety issues. We're engaging all the time because we, as an essential service, we've had people working all the way through it, learn some fantastic lessons in terms of what back to work looks like, what for other organizations, for what the governments are trying to deal with in terms of emerging and reopening the economy. Those levels of collaboration are new and I think pretty exciting. And so to the extent that we can look at some of these things, but I would really caution, it's not just government and it's not just industry. I think that collaboration is going to end up being key.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So maybe that's a good point to segue to a conversation around looking ahead to the future of Canada's oil and gas sector. And as we look forward to the point in time where the current crisis begins to abate, and we hope that's going to be sooner rather than later, how do you see the oil and gas sector within Canada emerging in the future? And if we're predicting that oil prices might be low for an extended period of time, and maybe oil demand is also going to be somewhat reduced, what do you think companies need to be doing at this point to remain competitive and to come out of this in a fighting fit manner? And what about Samantha or Gord? Do you want to jump in on this?
Gord, do you want to go and I'll come in behind? We can do the upstream, then the midstream perspective.
Yeah, well, at the most fundamental level, Guy, you have to be a low-cost producer. So that's just the burning platform of for everyone in a commodity-based business like this. So it'll be lean and mean coming out, and there could be a different structure to the sector of through consolidation and that kind of thing. But also just to add that I think there'll be more of a conversation about the role of Canada as an oil producing country in the global world, because an impact of COVID, I think, is that resilience of supply chains is emerging as one of the central insights coming out of COVID, that you can't afford disruption of supplies of key products. You have to have reliability under all circumstances. Canada is a player in that global oil world, and we're a player that is in a well-governed country. And so I think Canada plays a very critically important role to ensure a resilient global supply of oil going forward. We often talk environment, social, and governance aspects of oil and gas, as ESG being the acronym, but the G part doesn't get discussed a whole lot. A lot of the oil in the world is in jurisdictions that have not democratically formed governments. They do bad things with the revenue, and so I think dialogue will emerge about what does a resilient global supply of oil look like in a carbon constrained and low growth world. So I'm looking to see that discussion happen. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
So Gord, just to pick up on your first point, you mentioned that being a low cost producer is going to be absolutely critical in an environment where global demand has fallen and shrunk. What scope is there for the Canadian oil and gas sector to really drive down costs? Is this mainly a matter of scale and consolidation, or do we need significant more innovation as well?
Definitely more innovation. So that burning platform to innovate is there in a huge way. I do think in the oil sands case, there is a step change in competitiveness, carbon competitiveness, that's still possible there. I mentioned about getting off of steam as a way of extracting oil to solvents and electricity. These technologies are close to commercial, or in the case of Imperial's Aspen project, they actually had applied for a commercial scale solvent project. And so this isn't pie in the sky or field of dreams stuff. This is tangible steps that could put Canada on a much more competitive level, both on carbon and on cost. Mm-hmm. So it's not a mature sector in that regard, but it is going to take capital to do it. And we are going to need to attract the capital investment. But I also want to remind everyone that we're also competing for ideas and talent. And so that's also a key aspect of the future going forward, is we have to be a place where the best and the brightest want to come to bring their ideas, bring their entrepreneurial spirit, and to set up and get that diversification agenda energized and make it and bring it to life. So if we can make Canada an attractive spot to bring the best and brightest here, that's going to serve all of us very well. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Thank you. Samantha, let's turn over to you. What do you think it's going to take for Canadian energy companies, and I guess particularly from your perspective, pipeline companies, to survive this and to come out stronger as we look to the future of the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, and I think I have to answer that not necessarily from the perspective of a pipeline company, because we're all partners together, but more stepping up a level. And that's because if we look at where the puck is going, it means in an environment where we've gone from what we believed was resource scarcity, particularly in oil. And remember, it's an oil and a gas story, which then inevitably also becomes a power story. We need to look at end use markets? Do we understand where those end use markets are, and where is there an opportunity for us as an industry sector to start to create those markets, right? So if the puck is moving, so transportation is X%, coal to gas switching, gas fire generation is X%, petchem is X%, how much of that gets exported? What about what's happening in Asia? Are we able to be players in those global markets? Are we able to place our molecules in those global markets? And as pipeline companies, are we making sure that we're at the front door of all of the important export terminals, all of the important export facilities to make sure that, in a cost-effective manner, all of those molecules can be waterborne? And I think that's something that's going to become more and more important, in addition to continuing to deliver the energy needs of North America, not just Canada. So I think we're all in this one together. So the other piece to that, there's another interesting dimension to this equation, and innovation. We've talked about that quite a bit today. I think it isn't only innovation in lifting costs, and for us, innovation, for example, autonomous pipeline, safety, integrity, reliability, emissions, etc. What we're also curious about subsequent to COVID is we're watching global supply chains. So I think, I wonder if there's an opportunity going forward as people look to diversify their global supply chains, because they learned they weren't as diversified as they thought they were, and that a supply chain can be a break. Is that an opportunity also for Canada to become more competitive and play a role as part of a supplier if some of those supply chains shift away from other previous markets that were assumed to be, reliable markets that had longevity? Mm-hmm. So we may see the silver lining and some opportunities outside of this in places we don't necessarily expect.
So the argument there is that maybe if there's an increased emphasis on national energy security, then Canada looks a little bit more favorable compared to some other suppliers. Is that the argument here? That maybe Canada looks good relative to some other countries?
I think it could. I mean, I'm not just speaking to the molecules and the energy supply. I'm talking about the suppliers as part of delivering energy. So, your fabrication shops, your engineering shops. There's a whole range of, like I said, oil and gas. Previously, before we had our price collapse, was 10% of Canada's GDP, if not more than that, once you include the number of sectors associated with supporting that. There is a whole ecosystem of organizations and industry sectors that support delivering energy. And I think when we look at our global supply chain, we were quite impressed with how resilient it was at this stage and the limited impact as a result of lockdowns and COVID. However, in working with our peers, we're certainly looking, and I'm sure our shipper partners are looking as well, to diversify those supply chains. And is there an opportunity for Canadian companies to step up and be a part of that, to play a bigger role, where previously some of that supply chain input may have been from other countries or other organizations. So I think it may potentially be a silver lining where you look 3 to 5 years from now, how the Canadian energy landscape looks. And it isn't just about the producers or the midstream companies, it's all of the ecosystem that supports that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So maybe, Martha, we could turn to you in terms of looking ahead to the future of Canada's oil and gas sector, and particularly with your sustainability hat on. How can the sector emerge stronger as we look to potentially a very different energy market and energy demand in the coming years?
Well, I think that it will be very interesting to see how markets, whether they're or globally or just within Canada or just within the, think of the value proposition in their energy. And I think, Gord, you mentioned about ESG and how people don't think about the governance piece. Well, that's a huge part, and that does speak to resilience, but it also speaks to the lack of corruption. It speaks to trust. It speaks to I think there are some interesting opportunities for what people see as the value. And, historically, oil, gas it's all been, price or access, right? Didn't matter where it came from. Differences between light and heavy and where it's going to get refined and where, but generally, there hasn't been a whole lot of, well, I would prefer that source of oil or that company's oil, other than perhaps at the retail level where, there have been efforts to the market, but they have a market in that sense. But one of the things that I've been saying since moving to Suncor is that whereas Suncor in the upstream part didn't have to really market, because it didn't really have end consumers that our Petro-Canada side did. But actually, Suncor now has 37 million customers, in the sense of public opinion has become so much more important. The entire population of Canada cares about the environment. The entire population of Canada cares about what we collectively are doing or not doing. Sometimes it's the very difficult conversations. So I think there's the governance piece, there's the social piece, all questions about the importance of reconciliation and engagement with Indigenous communities. More and more people across Canada, North America, and certainly Europe, but globally, are looking at the things that matter to them. And it's not just think that as we move forward, there's a real opportunity for Canadian energy because of all of those good things that we think that we feel so proud about. That we have a long way to go on a lot of the environmental things, for sure. We've made huge progress over the last decade, and I say we collectively, the industry, with big investments, by the way. Like, a lot of money's gone into making really big improvements. Proud of what we've done. Really interested in what we can do going forward, for sure. But I think it coincides with the larger public, the larger consuming public, and certainly investors, in terms of what's the value that they attach to not only what we produce, but how we produce it and what that means in terms of our role in society. And I just, as a Canadian, I'm actually really excited about what that might mean. A lot of work to do, for sure, but I think there's a really interesting future.
Great, thank you for that. So I'm mindful of time and we are running up against the clock here. I would like to end up with a discussion about, are there any optimistic or reasons to be a little bit more positive in outlook? We've seen a lot of gloom and doom over the last few months, and the oil and gas sector has clearly had a tough time. Are there any aspects where you see some glimmers of hope and some positive indicators that actually things may be sort of more positive and moving in the right direction? And Gord, maybe we can turn to you, given your sort of perspective and rich history in the sector.
Well, Guy, as I look at the world that we operate in today, the polarization that is at play is also one of the key challenges we face as Canadians. And the debate about the future of oil and Canada as a producer of oil has been polarized as part of that as well. What I'm hopeful of is us being able to have a better conversation, a more productive conversation about the future value creation from oil, and how do we maximize value creation, not just from an economic point of view, but also from a social and environmental perspective as well. And so that is, how do we use the revenue from oil to meet other societal needs? What's the role of Canada globally as an oil producer in the world? Because ultimately it's a global scale story about what the future of oil supply and demand will be. It's a challenge for Canadians to have to think at a global scale about energy transition, but that's what oil causes us to do. And to think about value creation from a hydrocarbon molecule perspective as well. So it's not just about producing oil for fuel. That's often what polarizes the dialogue in a carbon-constrained world. But it's how can you do and get better value from hydrocarbon molecules, which might mean even producing things like hydrogen going forward. and doing that in some ways that are environmentally sound. Or carbon fiber, Martha mentioned beyond bitumen. We see a body of work and a global competition that's been called for how to produce carbon fiber from our hydrocarbon molecules. So I think value creation through the entire life cycle of that product and how it can be used to benefit all Canadians. Thanks.
Thank you. Samantha, any more optimistic views?
Well, here are my thoughts. I think the silver lining is going to take a little bit to come, but it will be when the market balances. And what that'll mean is that we are going to have producers and customers who come out of that situation much stronger, able to be at scale, able to advance some of the initiatives relative to innovation and energy transition, because the balance sheets will be stronger and they'll be much more resilient. So I think that's a first important step. I think there's another silver lining, and this is before COVID and before OPEC Plus and et cetera. And that is some of the partnership opportunities and the collaboration that's happening, because people are realizing how important energy is. And it isn't just oil, it's gas and it's power. And for example, you see in the power sector, partnerships with First Nations, new innovative arrangements in terms of equity sharing, et cetera, as we're building transmission lines, right? We see it as we're building pipeline infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of innovation that, we've switched to COVID, we've switched to some of the challenges, but, the silver lining is that those start to take shape, they start to take form. We collectively recognize the importance of energy. We collectively recognize Canada's position in that. I mean, we're North American, but I think if I speak from the Canadian lens, as a major contributor to any of the broader goals that we look to achieve, whether that be diversification, whether that be climate change. But I think those silver linings are going to take a little bit of time because, the near-term impacts of OPEC Plus markets rebalancing and what happens with COVID and what that means for how we work, what it means for supply chains and a number of other things is a consideration in the near term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you. Martha, I think we are ending up.
Of course, you're cutting out, so I don't know if you can even hear me now.
It was me cutting out or else whether it was you, but I can hear you.
I can't, you're both frozen.
Oh, sorry.
If I would say if you can hear me, I think I actually was being very positive earlier, and I think with Samantha talking about what happens when the market returns, I think Canada is actually really well placed, and I think our industry is going to be very well placed to take advantage in ways that we may not have thought of. But I would also say that I think COVID has been really, I think it will allow us to refresh the conversation about sustainability, because it's not just the environment, and and that's not to take away from the importance of the environment, but real sustainability is the planet, but it's people and it's prosperity. And if we don't have prosperity, which we're seeing, we have people losing their jobs, we have people suffering, we have families struggling. That will allow us to reset a little bit the conversation, move away from the polarization that Gord talked about, and regain the ability to have really thoughtful, objective, thorough, honest conversations about where we move forward as a country on all of those levels. And we're just not interested in the polarized discussion. We want to find solutions and work to find them. And that speaks to the collaboration with government. I think there are some very positive things to come out of this.
Great. Well, that's a wonderful point to finish on. And I'd really like to say thank you very much to all of you for a very thoughtful conversation and really shedding some light from your perspective based in Calgary on issues confronting a sector that is crucial for Canada. So thank you again for your time and for your thoughtful commentary on these issues. And at this point, I'm pleased to hand it back to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Guy. I am grateful that we were able to finish on a positive note and talk about some of the silver linings here. We're all so deeply engaged in the news of the day, and so much of it is so troubling. So finding that balance between what's actually happening and what is possible for the future really struck the right tone. Guy, thank you for your moderation. Guy Holburn, Professor of Business Economics and Public Policy, and also the Director of the Ivey Energy Policy and Management Center, Ivey Business School at Western University. And to our panelists, Martha Hall Findlay, Chief Sustainability Officer at Suncor, Samantha Stuart, Vice President of Corporate Strategy and Development at TC Energy, and Gordon Lambert, the former CEO of the Alberta Energy Regulator. Thank you for joining the Canadian Club of Toronto in this virtual event. There are many more events coming to you through the end of May and into the end of our season at the end of June. If you haven't already, please sign up for our newsletter online, our newsletter, and our newsletter. And a special thanks to our tech supplier, our tech partner, VVC. Have a great rest of your afternoon and see you again soon.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you.